All right, back to our put function. We are using this if statement to validate the user object that is sent with the request. Now, this works for simple objects, but for more complex objects, we'll end up with too many if statements. In those situations, it's better to use a validation library. There are many different validation libraries out there, and different people like different tools. The one that I personally like is Zod. You can learn about it at zod.dev. I also talked about this in my React course. In that course, I showed you how we can use Zod to validate our React forms. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you the basics, and I will leave it up to you to read the documentation and learn more. So first we go into terminal and install Zod. All right, good. Now back to our project. Here in the users folder, API/users, we add a new file called schema. In this file, first we import z from Zod. Then we call z.object and give it an object that defines the shape of our user objects. So here we can say that our user object should have a name property, and name should be string, so we call z.string. We can also apply a minimum length of 3. Now, if we had other properties, we could add them here. For example, we could say a user needs an email, which is also a string and of type email. Similarly, we could add an age property and say age should be a number. So using this syntax, we define our validation rules. With Zod, we can validate strings, numbers, dates, and more complex objects. Now, in this lesson, we don't really need age and email, so I'm going to delete them. So we call the object method. This returns a schema. We store it here, and then export it as a default object from this module. Now we go back to our route file. On the top, we import our schema. Now back to our put function. Instead of using this if statement to validate body.name, we call schema.saveParse. We also have the parse method. The difference is that the parse method throws an exception if there is a validation error, but saveParse doesn't yell at us. It just returns an object that contains the result of validation. So we call this method and give it the body object. Then we get the validation result and store it here. Next, we change our condition to if validation is not successful, then we return an error. But here we don't want to hard code this error message. We want to return the errors that are detected by Zod. So we replace this object with validation.error.errors. Okay, now let's test this. So back in Postman, let's send a put request to this endpoint and set the name to an empty string. Take a look. So here's what we get. We get an array of error objects. Each error object has a few properties like code, minimum, type, inclusive, exact, and so on. Now here we have the actual error message. Of course, we can transform this object into a simpler structure to return to the client. So this is how we can validate our objects using Zod. Now we need to use the same technique in our post function. So let's go to this route file in the users folder. Again, on the top, we import schema. And in our post function, once we have the body, we call schema.saveParse and pass the body to get the validation result. Next, we check if validation is not successful. Then we return validation.error.errors.